In a world where the job market is shifting super fast and is totally unpredictable, success no longer follows a straight line. So, how do you stand out when the odds are stacked against you? Welcome to the Learn It All podcast, the show for today's leaders who want to get ahead and stay ahead because we believe great leaders aren't born or made, we're always in the making. I'm your host, Damon Lemby, two-time best-selling author and CEO of Learn It, a live learning platform that has helped upskill over 2 million people over the past 3 decades. In today's episode, Juan Silvera, who's an author, C-level marketing executive, and global thought leader, is going to share his powerful story of going from the streets of Colombia to achieving international success as a C-level executive, and what it really takes to become improbably successful.
Anybody, I don't care if you're an entrepreneur, the CEO of a Fortune 500, a first-time job applicant out of college for that entry-level job associate role and that kind of thing, the best communicator will always win.
In a moment, Juan's going to be joining me, and we're going to be discussing how being different is a superpower, not a liability, why taking risks is essential for growth, how humor can be a great business tool if you use it correctly, and why speaking a second language is an undervalued asset. Juan, there are people listening who've been overlooked in their careers or just don't feel like the obvious choice. What does improbably successful look like to people like that?
Yeah, so first and foremost, thanks for having me, Damon. It's a pleasure. So in business, there's a definite set of odds and probabilities of being successful that start when you're born, right off the start, right? And so those factors like your background, your place of birth, your socioeconomic profile, and those types of things, those things have a definite bearing on, in theory, how well you will do, whether you're an entrepreneur or you're pursuing something in corporate. So those things sort of imagine as if there's like a statistical model that says, look, if you're born like this, or if you have access to these kinds of opportunities, or if you went to this school, or you grew up in this part of the world, or your skin color is XYZ, there's already kind of a sort of a preset statistical model that can, with a high degree of accuracy, predict how you're going to do in life, professionally. Now, my observation in the past 3+ decades as a professional and kind of working around the world, and my own personal experience, is that there's certain folks that are improbably successful and they beat the odds, despite that, a statistical reality. And so what I've done is I've studied very carefully what are the strategies and the behaviors that are conducive to success against all odds.
Well, Juan, you open your book with a really powerful story about growing up in Medellín, Colombia. Can you share with our listeners that story and kind of how it connects to your message, your overall message with your professionals?
As you pointed out, I was born and raised in Medellín, Colombia, which back then looked very different to what it did today. It was a place where, you think back to the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. It's a difficult place, to grow up as a child. One of my very earliest memories is, I was maybe 5 or 6 years old, and I was looking out my window, and there were these 2 teenage kids, and they were actually involved in like a knife fight. They were like going at it, and as a 6-year-old, you're kind of looking at this with some amusement. And sadly, one of the kids, killed the other kid, stabbed him. And when you're a 6-year-old, everything's normal. Now, I'm not saying that was a daily occurrence in our neighborhood. But what that did, for those of us that were kids growing up in that environment, and again, it's gotten a lot better. Medellin right now is like a tourist destination, like a global tourist destination. That's how much it's changed for the better. But back then it was tough. But what that did for those of us that were part of that generation is we grew up with this sort of like sixth sense, this instinct, this kind of friend or foe kind of thing. So I'll tell you, how this sort of manifests itself in real life. Let's say you and I are walking down the street in Manhattan or downtown LA. I can kind of see 2 blocks down the street if there's somebody who's a little bit, shady, and I'll actually, without even thinking about it, I'll switch sidewalks. But it's completely unconscious, right? It's not like oh my God, that guy's coming. I just switch sidewalks. In the business world, the way that manifests itself is I can go into a meeting, I can go into a business meeting, and again, in a very subconscious kind of way, within seconds, I can kind of tell who's friend or foe. Again, because you kind of grow up with this, survival sort of instinct, growing up in the mean streets of Medellín, Colombia, back in the day. Again, not today. So one point that I make in the book, which I think it's important to underscore, is that in today's business environment, even those, that sixth sense, even those instincts that are well developed as a result of maybe growing up in adverse conditions, are not enough to succeed. Because the job place and business has changed. It's gotten incredibly competitive. So Damon, you may remember, because we're probably similar age, when we were growing up, there was kind of this playbook, right? For you to be successful, you went to the right school, and if not, then you went to a so-so school, but you got a degree, you got the internship, you got this, and there was kind of like, if you do this, this will happen. If then, right? If you network right and do these kinds of things. And that was enough to kind of guarantee you some degree of success. But that's changed, first and foremost, because it's become increasingly and incredibly competitive. It used to be that when I was competing for an assignment, let's say in California where you're at, I was competing with the guys around me and the gals around me. Now I'm competing with people in Brazil, in India, in Eastern Europe, et cetera, et cetera. The advent of the internet, the fact that you and I are using this technology to communicate with all these people, it's basically changed the game. So it's not enough. It's not enough to follow the prescribed sort of scripts. And that's one of the things that, I talk a little bit about in the book.
And one of the things about your book, you talk a lot about taking risks. Now, you mentioned you grew up, you have this survival instinct. What role does taking risks, such as switching industries, relocating, or stepping into really unfamiliar grounds, how did that really play a part in your career growth?
Yeah, so I think one of the reasons I've done relatively well is precisely because I've taken risk throughout my life, and I've also noticed this in other people. I'll give you a real life example. About 25 years or so ago, during the .com days, for those of you that remember, between 95 and 2000. There was an opportunity, and I was working for a startup in South Florida. We had what was back then called an internet consulting company, which is really a digital marketing company nowadays. But back then it was the internet guys. And so there's an opportunity came up to move to Europe and do a similar startup there in Austria, of all places, in Salzburg, Austria. And my wife and I had 3-year-old twin girls. And we lived in South Florida, and the opportunity was amazing because it implied moving there and starting a digital marketing agency with investors there. And this was again in the nascent days of the internet, so there was a lot of upside, but there was also immense risk, financial risk, because you don't know.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I didn't speak German back then, so you move to a completely different culture. If you can just imagine transporting your family from the beautiful suburbs of Boca Raton to the Alps in Salzburg, Austria.
What a supportive partner in your wife.
I'm lucky. I'm very lucky. But it was a huge risk. I mean, financially, we could have lost everything. We could have lost a couple of years of our lives. There's a lot of downside when you make a move that magnitude. But I will tell you, Damon, that what I've learned about leadership, what I learned about adaptability, what I learned about running a business from scratch, because the first day on the job, I walked into an empty room, and there was a table, and there were 4 Macs. And then our Austrian investor says to me, he's like, well, start as an internet company is what they used to call it back in the day. And I can tell you 2 or 3 stories like that. Before that, I got an assignment in Mexico City and an assignment in Caracas, Venezuela. This was before, Venezuela got to the point where it is today. And all those opportunities came with a huge amount of risk, because it's easier to kind of stay put and follow the beaten path, if you will. But with every one of those opportunities with every one of those risks that we took, came immense opportunities, because nothing but great things came after that. If nothing else, from a professional and personal development, right? Just doing these types of things, which at the moment, quite frankly, seem insane. We were delirious. I remember when we talked about moving to Europe, our friends and family, they used to go, it's like, you have this amazing gig in Florida. Like, what are you doing? Like, are you out of your mind? But looking back, those were all great decisions, not without risk, though, Damon.
So Juan, let's say I'm listening to you right now, and I've got a good, cushy job. It's someplace I've been for a long time, but I want to make a move. I want to get out of my comfort zone. Do you have any advice or a decision-making technique somebody could look at, or framework to maybe make a decision like this?
Well, the first thing is that there is no right path, right? And so I hope that nobody believes that I'm suggesting you have to make this huge, life-changing risk. Look, I have a lot of friends going back, 20, 30 years, who have done very well by themselves by staying put. And staying with the same company 10, 15, 20 years, or staying in the same sort of area of work in the same geography. There's nothing wrong with that. Damon, the success, what you and I call success, may be completely different. Only you can determine what success is, right? Now, for me personally, it's been around, making changes and growth and that kind of thing. But that's, for me, that's my reality. But assuming that, you do want to make a change, one of the things that I talk about in the book is a certain set of criteria, or things that you have to ask yourself before you make such a change. Number one, are you gonna benefit financially? Is this going to advance you, from a compensation and career point of view? Is this going to be a good move for you and your family? Because let's say hypothetically that you get a call and you say, look, there's this amazing job, but it's in Singapore, and you have little ones, and you have a spouse or a partner. That's a family move. Is everybody going to win? If it's just you, and you cannot just sacrifice the other 2 or 3 people in your life for the move. So there are certain sort of things that you have to look in the mirror and you got to go, okay, well, this makes a lot of sense, professionally, from a family point of view, from a career development point of view, and only then you pull the trigger. Again, if that's something that you want. One of my best friends from college was a first responder all his life. Never moved from the town where he was born and grew up, and perfectly happy, great, fulfilling life. That worked for him, right? Maybe not for you and I, but you define what your success is. But yeah, for those that want to make changes, big changes, make sure that it all checks out.
And one thing I'd add to that, I call it purposeful awfulizing. It's think about that decision you're going to make. Fast forward a year and take it to the negative. Like, what's the worst outcome that could happen? And if it is, can you overcome that? Is it going to bankrupt you? Is it going to cause you to get a divorce, or whatever it is, right? So, you keep that in mind. But I think what you said is very important about, understanding what success means for you. But one, we also have a lot of people who change is being forced on them these days.
That's right.
Whether it's through layoffs, or maybe they're just getting out of college and they got to move in a different direction. And you talk a lot about, the importance of having a plan. So let's go there for a minute, a vision and a plan.
Yeah. I mean, your comment, Damon, could not be more timely. So at the moment you and I are having this conversation, it's one of the most interesting job markets I've seen in my entire life. And we don't need to get into the why. I mean, I think people that are listening, I think they know what you and I are talking about, right? There's an incredible amount of uncertainty, both in government and in the private sector and that kind of thing. What I have seen, my observation in this last 30 plus years has been that the one thing that helps through times of uncertainty is having a very well-defined and clear plan and goal, right? And again, it doesn't have to be the same for everybody. It's your plan, it's your goal. But that clarity right? And of knowing this is where I need to go. That is very helpful because that is the one thing that during times of uncertainty, and God forbid a layoff or something like that, or you have a small enterprise and something changes, that big gigantic contract that you were counting on disappears, or 80% of your revenue comes from this one client, the client disappears, and it's like, oh my God, I got to do layoffs and this kind of stuff. This stuff happens in real life. It's happening right now at somewhat of a massive scale. So having a very clear sort of goal and a plan B to go with that, right? To your earlier point, because not everything, things don't always go as expected. But having that clarity is immensely helpful because that's your north during times of uncertainty.
So how does somebody start moving that direction to get some clarity?
Well, I think, and I talk a little bit about this book, Damon, is I think you have to do what I call an inventory of your skills and who you are as a professional and as a human being, right? The job market is like any other market, is subject to the laws of supply and demand, right? So think of it as two columns, right? On column one, you have everything that you are and who you are as a professional, right? And then the second column is kind of what the job expects and what the job needs right now. And so the exercise here is to match those two things, right, at any given point in time, because the column on the right is always sort of moving, right? If you look at the types of, let's talk about somebody who is a DI professional, go back 2 or 3 years. There's a huge demand for people with those background and with that background and that kind of training. Today, maybe not so much so. But if you were working in that space, you probably have all kinds of transferable skills. There are things that you bring to the table, maybe not necessarily as a chief diversity officer, which, there may not be a lot of those, at least in the short term. But there's all these things that you bring to the table. Perhaps you're an exceptional communicator. Maybe you're a critical thinker. Maybe you're creative, right? Maybe you're a great problem solver, those types of things. Enterprises, big and small, will always need people with those kinds of skills. So during times like this, the right thing to do, the smart thing to do is to back and say, okay, let's take a true objective inventory of what I bring to the table, and let me observe and understand kind of where the market is going and what are the kinds of people that the market needs right now. And I guarantee you that there's a match there. Now you have to be objective too, right? Because this is where ego sometimes steps in. It's like, oh, how dare they? Like, look at me. I'm this amazing professional and this kind of thing. Well, guess what? The market doesn't care what you think about yourself.
Yeah, I mean, you said a lot right there. One, you have to be reflective and honest with yourself. Two, I think it's important to not wrap yourself up in a specific identity, like
Right.
like as a chief diversity officer, and that's all you are, in this particular case, because all those skills, number three, what you said, are so transferable in a lot of ways. And
Right.
and people don't realize that. I see that all the time in the people I coach or mentor. They're like, well, I've always been doing this. And then as they do that inventory list, one on the right-hand side, I think you said, then it starts to open their eyes like, okay, I can use this skill for this, and this. The one thing I want to add to that one, because I've interviewed 1,000 people just like you. And when you see that job description or the requirements, a lot of times people don't apply because they don't feel like they meet all 5 of them. I want to
Right.
say, apply anyways, because
Mhm.
a lot of times, you can connect with people and you can be a great fit for jobs, and you just got to go out there and get out of your comfort zone and try and move forward with it.
And there are certain skills. I mean, not all skills are the same, right? To me, the master skill is communication. Anybody, I don't care if whether you're an entrepreneur, the CEO of a Fortune 500, a first-time job applicant out of college for that entry-level job associate role and that kind of thing, the best communicator will always win. Even if it's an engineering job that expects you to be in front of a computer writing code all day, the best communicator will always win. And that's an acquired skill, right? There's no reason for anybody not to be a better communicator over the course of time if you set your mind to it. So, you know, again, going back to the point I was trying to make earlier about taking that inventory, are you a strong communicator? If not, then there's things that you can definitely do to do so. I've worked with a lot of people in technology, of course, in the course of my career, and brilliant, brilliant people, Damon. You've probably worked with some of them. Some of them are just down the freeway from where you're sitting right now in Silicon Valley. And inevitably, and most of the time, the people that have the ability to translate complex concepts into simplicity through the use of words or the written word are the people that make the most headway. That is the most valued and skill set in any kind of business setting is communication.
Juan, how can somebody self-assess themselves to see if they are a strong communicator or weak?
Ask. People will tell you. People will tell you. And there's a whole bunch of little things that you can do. For example, your vocabulary, your lexicon. That's anybody. I mean, for a long time, I used to do this like word a day type of thing, where here's a word. The English language is beautiful. It's got like thousands and thousands of words that are very precise in their meaning. This is the thing about the English language. And it's amazing how the right use of the right word will save you tons of time and can bring about, significant clarity when you communicate with others. The funny thing is, I remember earlier in my life talking to some of my peers, how sometimes they would be critical and they would say, "Oh, you use all these big words." It's like, like why? What are you trying to prove? It's not about trying to come across more intelligent or trying to say, "Look, I have an incredible vocabulary." No, it's about the precision that the English language brings about, and then making that available to yourself. And that has nothing to do with whether you have an accent or not. Some of the best spoken people that I've ever met are people whose English is their second language, interestingly enough.
I think what you're saying there, which is so important, is making things simple. It's not about using these big words and trying to show how smart you are. It's being able to connect with somebody, and whether it's through writing or through verbal communication, where they can actually understand what you're saying.
Right.
And in your book, you talk a lot about writing, listening, and even humor. Let's go through, and I think you have a framework that people can learn to get better at communicating, right?
Yeah, in fact, I do. And it's funny you mentioned listening, because that's quite possibly the hardest one. That is, at least for me, because I always have a lot to say, unfortunately. Ask my wife, she'll tell you, it's like, okay. She tells me, where's the off button? Like, where do I turn them off? Because
I know what you mean.
Yeah,
I'm
well,
right there with
the
you.
feeling, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Listening is the hardest thing, but it's also the most rewarding and the most effective when it comes to communicating. And it took me like 4 years to learn my first language. It took me another 10 to learn my second one, and it took me like another 5 to learn my third language. It's taken me almost 60 years to learn how to listen. Right? And it's really, really, really hard, but it pays off instantly, especially in a leadership role. Because when you're in a position of leadership, our default mode is to dispense wisdom and advice and guidance and direction and a vision, right? It's almost like society, right? Society has this expectation of great leaders to be able to communicate a vision and get people emotionally vested and excited and motivated and that kind of thing. When sometimes what's really required is STFU, right? Just shut them up.
Yeah.
Just listen, and you learn so much. So that's one thing with regards to communication. The other thing that I've seen works very well, especially if you're not a natural born communicator, because there are people that have this innate ability to communicate, and some that, but having command of the facts in your area, right? So I've seen situations where somebody comes into a meeting or a business meeting, whether you're an entrepreneur or you're in a business setting, and maybe they're just not that compelling a communicator, but they have their facts together, right? And they know they do their homework, they come prepared. And what that does is two things. Number one is it helps you to sort of communicate, but it also gives you a lot of leverage in a setting like that because you have the facts. There's no shortage of people, that can talk, but people that really, really know the facts and have command of the facts that are relevant to that particular conversation. That's also communicating, right? So it's not just being this amazing inspirational speaker, right? A lot of the times, people say very compelling things and communicate in a very effective manner just by being able to have command of the facts.
I also like how you talk about how to leverage humor when it comes to communication.
Right. So that's one of the themes of the book, and that is to how can you use your uniqueness, your advantage, in a business setting. Going back earlier to our conversation about being different and this kind of thing. So there are certain things that on the surface would seem to be a disadvantage, professionally speaking, and in reality, they are they're competitive advantages in disguise, if you will. So let's talk a little bit about humor. So humor in certain parts of the country, humor is part of the culture. Any of you that have ever traveled through the Caribbean, for example, either the Spanish or English speaking Caribbean or even the French Caribbean, the minute you get off that airplane, people smile. There's this, joking around and this kind of thing. This is just part of the culture. I'm not an anthropologist, so I cannot tell you why, but I do know this for a fact. So they did this landmark study in Germany a few years back, and they looked at 39, industrial companies. And what they did is the study tried to understand and answer the question, what is the impact of humor in a workplace? Right? Very objectively. Now, this is Germany, which is a Northern European country, right? Humor it's there, there is some levity, but not to the extent that there are in other parts of the world, like the Caribbean, for example. And what they found is that in those work teams where there was more humor, the right kind of humor, in the workplace, there was greater creativity. There was a greater degree of problem solving and more collaboration. So what the study was able to establish was a direct correlation between humor in the workplace and all these kind of very desirable business outcomes that you want in a business setting.
Why did humor in that study unlock this extra growth when it comes to the, business?
If it's used properly, if it's used in the right way, right, it's incredibly powerful. Now, there's one caveat on this, Damon, and that is you got to be careful with humor, especially in this day and age. So I remember working 20, 30 years ago, and there was a certain kind of standard for humor and this kind of thing. That band has become very narrow now. And let's be honest, a lot of people get easily offended. And I'm not saying that's a good or bad thing.
Has it ever hit you? Have you ever been in a situation where you thought you were going the right direction with humor and got...
Yeah. So being Hispanic, there's always this kind of thing where people, they're always late. For Southern Europeans, right? Italian, Spanish, Central American, South American. So one day I come into a meeting and I'm like 3 minutes late, right? Like 3 minutes late. And so I joke and I said, hey, please, don't get upset. I'm Hispanic. So I wrote it into my employment contract. This was my attempt at humor, that I can be at least 5 minutes late to every meeting. And this is okay. Now, there wasn't a single Hispanic person in that meeting, and yet somebody took offense.
Why?
Because they felt that I was being that I was stereotyping, even though I was
the Hispanic
subject of the joke, right?
Yeah.
So the point I'm trying to make, Damon, is that that band has become very narrow. But if you use humor in the right way without offending, I think this is the main thing. Like humor doesn't necessarily need to be at the expense of somebody else. In a professional setting, then it can be very, very powerful. here where I work, we try to do that. And people want to be happy and people want to enjoy their work and that kind of thing. And a good laugh is actually physiologically something that releases, stress and anxiety and that kind of thing. And again, I'm not a chemist, but I wouldn't be surprised if there's some kind of chemical reaction that happens in your brain whenever, you laugh and this kind of thing. The final point, and just to bring it back and to your initial question, Damon, is if you happen to have been born or raised in a culture where humor was part of everyday life, don't be afraid to bring that to the workplace, right? Because that may actually help you engage, get work done, be liked, be more influential, and that kind of thing. So that's one very simple example of using something that's very much a part of you, that's unique, that if you channel it the right way, right, it can be immensely powerful in a business setting.
I think it's important because especially if you're a senior leader, to not take yourself so seriously, and you could, people can ease up around you as long as it's not just constant all the time. You got to have some seriousness, but I think that if you're somebody who either can joke about themselves or just lightens up the room, because you're right, Juan, people want to be happy and enjoy
Yeah.
themselves. We spend so much time at work. But I want to stick on the subject because, in my opinion, I think the best part about your book and the core theme is really uniqueness and finding your superpower. So humor is one of them, but what advice do you have or practical exercise for somebody who wants to find out not necessarily what their strengths are, but what makes them unique?
Yeah. Again, we kind of go back to what we were talking about a few minutes ago, which is to take that hard look and that inventory of who you are as a person, as a professional, right? And then match that against what the marketplace needs. I did a little bit of research. This is interesting for your for the women in your audience. In preparing for the book, I did a little bit of research about women. And, because I put them in that group of improbably successful, quite frankly. The statistics still show that even today, as much headway as women have made in in the business world, the vast, vast majority of C-suites, boards, CEO roles, and they go to males. This is still a fact. Not like 50 years or so ago, and a lot of headway has been made. So on the surface, it would seem that if you're a woman, you come into business and the job market with some inherent disadvantages just by virtue of being a woman. But the science, according to some of the research I did, secondary research, seems to suggest that women have all these um, sort of instincts and the way the female brain is wired that actually can give them a competitive advantage in business situations. The ability, empathy, for example, and being able to connect emotionally much more easily than men. And again, at the risk of generalizing, hopefully I won't get any hate mail by saying what I'm saying. But this is science, right? This is not Juan's opinion. I do have an opinion. I live with three women in my house, my two daughters and my wife, and I will tell you that their emotional intelligence is orders of magnitude greater than mine. So if there is some truth behind what the study seems to suggest, which is that women have these abilities to connect emotionally, to read the room, to be able to capture things that for most men, at least, we have a difficulty, reading those emotions and this kind of thing. Guess what? That's incredibly important and incredibly useful in a work setting. Imagine that if you were to walk into a room and within seconds, you can already kind of sense things that other people can't. I mean, it's a huge superpower. It's like being invisible or being able to fly or being able to read minds. And yet, again, the science seems to suggest that women have this at a much greater degree than men. So if I'm a woman, first, I need to be aware of this fact, although you probably know already. And then it's like, you know what? Let me put that to good use in a work setting. If I have this instinct, if I have the ability to connect emotionally the way all these other people can't, then why would I not take advantage of that? I wish I had those abilities. Um, but yeah, so that's an example of being able to use those things. Yeah,
Can you give an example of how a woman could but by the way, I agree with you 100%. A lot of the best leaders of all time in Learn It's 30-year history have been women. They're sharp, very sharp, intuitive, empathetic, great at connecting. So,
yeah.
but how give an example of how they can take what we just said there and put it into use to better their opportunity to maybe get a promotion or a job.
Think about leadership traits that are associated with success, right? We were talking about listening, which is a form of empathy, right? Let's talk about being able to predict certain outcomes based on observation and these types of things. Now, these may seem a little bit ambiguous. I don't know if you're looking for a very specific instance, but I want us to focus on the collective,
Mhm.
the the sum of all of these things. Which again, if you look at successful leaders and successful entrepreneurs, it's almost like a checklist of everything that those people do that are great. I would say that's the key right there is go back, take a look and say, oh my God, I do these things that are just amazing. How can I put them to use in the work in a work environment? Can I be a better mentor? Can I lead not by just looking at the facts, but also by this thing that I have here, this gut feeling that, by the way, a lot of business decisions are made by instinct. The good ones are made using a combination of instinct and the facts. So if I have that, right, if I'm more in tune with the people I work with, because I have a higher emotional IQ, that inherently gives me, all these advantages. Um, of course, you still have to be good at what you do, right? Because most businesses are meritocracies, at least in a capitalistic system. So,
Yeah, I think what I hear you saying as well is knowing that you have that should give you confidence to be able to step up
yeah,
and display that and go forward with it. I also like how you talk about a lot of times people don't realize that speaking a second language can be such a big advantage.
yeah. Again, one of those things that, again, on the surface seems to be a disadvantage. So I remember many years ago when I worked at a financial institution in Charlotte, North Carolina, talking about 20 years or so ago. And I was talking to somebody, and they were saying, "No, such and such, she's great, but she has such a heavy accent." They were kind of saying that she was a great professional, except the but was that she had a heavy accent. I thought about this and I go, well, why does she have an accent? Well, she has an accent because English is her second or maybe third or fourth language. This is why the person has an accent. Now, to me, how could that be a disadvantage, right? When in a global job market and in a global business environment, going back to what we were talking about, the globalization of the workforce, there are so many roles and there's so many business opportunities for people that speak more than one language. So, having an accent is not having an accent. All that's telling you is that the person speaks another language. Real life example. Me, young college graduate, was working at Dun& and Bradstreet in Southern California, and it was an entry level job as an analyst. Right? Sounds very sexy. Oh, I'm an analyst at Dun& and Bradstreet. In reality, it was kind of like a data entry job and that kind of thing, and it was fine. It was a great job, great company. But I was actually so what they did is they did the ranking, and there was like 15 analysts in our group, and I was dead last. I was the worst of the 15. To the point where I think there were questions about whether I could, you know, keep the job or not. And it's not that I was dumb or anything like that. I just wasn't particularly engaged with the job. I thought, well, I have an MBA. I should be doing more than data entry. But that's how it is when you start, and that's okay. So I was like, okay, do I quit? Are they going to let me go on this kind of thing? So one day the person who was my manager calls me into her office, and I go, here we go. This is it. It's my last day. Where's the cardboard box?
Yeah.
And she goes, hey, Juan, I want to talk to you about something very seriously. And I said, okay, yeah, please, I'm all ears. And she goes, well, it turns out that our office in Mexico City is in need of somebody to help them develop a training program to train the analysts throughout Latin America. They had 4 offices. They had an office in Mexico, in Sao Paulo. They had an office in Buenos Aires, and they had an office in Caracas, Venezuela. And, we were looking at the analyst, and, you have an MBA, and, the role requires that the person be able to write and speak in Spanish. We have 15, 20 analysts here, and you're the only one that meets the criteria. So would you be interested in taking this assignment? It was an expat role, paid in dollars, paid housing, international assignment, the kind of stuff that a 26-year-old can only dream of. And Damon, the reason that opportunity presented itself is because I had the one skill that no one else had, which was being bilingual and being able to, write and speak and produce content and work well with others in another culture, in another language. So I cannot think of a better example of when something that, again, on the surface seems like a disadvantage, having an accent, in reality is, it's another language, and that comes handy, especially today when job markets and enterprises are global in nature. Hopefully that makes sense.
No, very well said. Especially today, global, virtual, hybrid, what an excellent advantage it is to be able to speak a
Yeah.
different language. It's incredible. Now, once we've determined what our unique superpowers are, you also dive deep into personal brand, which I think is incredibly important. Let's go there for a moment.
I've worked in marketing now for almost 30 years, and I've seen both agencies and clients work very hard and spend millions of dollars in advancing their brand, trying to position themselves different to others, and what are our key selling proposition, all this stuff that you do in brand marketing. And turns out that you, as a professional and as a business person, you are the product, and the same identical rules apply to you, right? Perception is reality in business. And one of the observations I've made over all these decades is that there's also a pattern where people that really are careful with how they project themselves and how they're seen and how they present themselves do tend to do better over the course of time. And it has nothing to do with vanity and dressing a certain way and this kind of thing. It has to do more with how you project yourself as a leader and as a professional person. And again, I can tell you countless stories, Damon, of people that are brilliant at what they do, brilliant, engineers, brilliant mathematicians, brilliant writers, and that's all fine. But if they neglect the most important asset and the most important thing that you need to sell, which is yourself. And again, it has nothing to do with prototypical stereotypes of what a successful person may look like. That's changed too. Again, it's a global marketplace, right? So whatever preconceived notions of what a successful person looked like in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, that's all out the window now. So it has to do more with how you project yourself as a professional, intellectually, right? Do you have the self-confidence that comes with knowing your stuff, right? Do you have the interpersonal skills? Do you have the gravitas, right, to be able to be convincing and to be able to influence people in a business setting? And all those things are acquired skills. Starts with, again, kind of taking an inventory of how you project yourself. And then, by the way, people will tell you. People can be candid if you ask them. Say, it's like, you know what, Juan? It's like, you're a great guy and, you're pretty smart guys, but have you noticed that you do this or you do that? And that's just not professional behavior and that kind of thing. So people will give you the feedback. In the book, I talk about 3 or 4 or 5, I think it's 5 things that you can do to sort of work on this very deliberately. Some of it, quite frankly, on the surface may look a little mundane, which is, your physical appearance, how you project. Because unfortunately, in society, there's still a lot of that, right? People, you walk into the room and people subconsciously within 5 minutes, Damon, they'll check out your shoes. They don't even think about it. They'll check out your shirt. They'll check out how, I can't explain it. It makes no sense to me because we should not be judged by our physical appearance or anything like that. How we, you know, but it does happen. And so things like that, your posture, do you look at people in the eyes when you talk to them? All these things add up to this brand that you want to project. And that, by the way, in this digital age, also extends to online. So I write a little bit about the right way of how to present yourself on places like LinkedIn. People are very judgmental, and they'll look at everything that you do and everything that you say. And do you come across as being this knowledgeable, professional, or well, I guess he's kind of interesting, he's kind of smart, but I don't know. So there are certain things that are, again, easy to do that oftentimes people neglect as professionals, right? That altogether make up that brand that is you.
I think one area that I see people can really set themselves apart, even today, is on LinkedIn. There's so many people. What you said earlier, perception is reality, is so true. A lot of people I coach or mentor, again, they'll say, "Well, Damon, I'm not a leader. I'm not a thought leader. Why do I need to be active or engaged on LinkedIn?" And my response to them, Juan, is you really need to be, because whether you're in a sales role, the first thing a prospect's going to do is they're going to look at you online, or whether you're looking to get promoted or looking for a new job, people are automatically, like you mentioned, they're going to go on to social networks. So you have to be really intentional and, I think, mindful where you play in that space and how you represent yourself.
Yeah, 100%. That is the brand. And I know there's 100 books on the topic, and there's people that know a lot more about how to manage your professional presence online than I do, but there are certain things that are just fundamental. Tell you a real life story. About 15 years ago, when I was in the Bay Area, and I worked for a bank right there on California Street in the financial district, I was looking for a person to come in
California
and
and what?
manage California and, oh man,
That's
the
okay.
Union Bank building right there.
Okay, yeah. I was on Montgomery in California forever.
Okay, I think it was
Yeah.
just down the street from the Wells Fargo building at the Union Bank building. And I remember I was hiring for somebody to come and help me manage social media for the bank. And it came down to 2 candidates, right? And they were both brilliant. They were both great. They both had the work experience and the qualifications. There's a difference between one and the other. One of them had a presence on Twitter, and they were, what's it called nowadays? X, whatever it's called this week. And they were there. Great LinkedIn profile. They were posting stuff related to digital marketing, white papers. They would, add smart things. I went and checked them on all the other social media, and they managed their professional image online in exactly the way I wanted them to help me manage the brand that I was managing at that time. The other person, who, by the way, had a degree from a much more prestigious university and had a few more years of experience, did not exist online. Right. So you have to kind of walk the walk, right? So guess who got the job? The person that had already demonstrated that they got digital marketing, because they managed their brand in a similar fashion to what my expectations would be that they would manage our brand. So she got the job. Oh, and by the way, she had a blog, and this was before blogging was cool and, and all these things. So that is a real life example of winning by just being aware of the fact that people will check you out. People will check you out. Also, by the way, whenever you're applying for a job, I got a little secret for you. The headhunters will go and they'll go through your, if you have an open Instagram profile, they'll go through every post. They're just looking for stuff. They'll go through your LinkedIn, whatever you have out there. They will Google you and they will go through every little bit of content that you post out. They're looking for both the good and the bad. So you are no different than any other brand, and you're subject to the same degree of scrutiny that any, let's say, consumer brand, packaged consumer product is subject to. So be careful.
Absolutely.
Be careful.
No, be careful and be proactive. Set yourself apart.
Right.
I mean, I think that is so important. Now, Juan, your book, as we wrap up here, it's been, by the time this episode comes out, it'll be close to a year that it's been out.
That's right.
Has there been anything that you no longer buy into that you wrote from your book, or anything that you really want to double down on based off the feedback and conversations you've had with people?
The principles, Damon, are still the same. I don't think so. Those things have changed. If I was to do a second edition, I would probably add a chapter about, the change in the marketplace and in American society as it pertains to all things DEI. Because there's a section of the book where I talk about, how to use your diversity to your advantage and that kind of thing. In the context of a meritocracy, right? I've never advocated for anybody getting a job on the basis of their, background or anything like that. You still have to be good. You still have to do your. But the pendulum has swung this way in the last, few months. And I'm not saying it's good or bad. That's just the reality of society and the labor market. But if I had to do anything different, I'm not sure I would change anything to the book. I would just add a chapter about, how to still win in an environment that has radically changed as it pertains to how diversity, equity, and inclusion, at least institutionally, what that means today. And don't be surprised if he swings back around in the next 4 years. That's just the nature of society. But that's the only that I would add an addendum to the book. But that's why we have these conversations so that we can
Exactly, right? To go back and see it. So it'll be interesting what happens. Well, we've talked a lot about your book, but is there one thing or anything else that you want to share with our listeners around your book or your career before we wrap up?
No, I would say, look, don't forget the fundamentals. We talked about a lot of subtleties.
Very important.
We talked a little bit about science and we talked about emotional IQ and some of the things that may be things that you don't consider. Look, if you have a job interview, show up on time.
Don't even show up if you're going to be late. Seriously.
Exactly. I mean, those are the basic things. Keep a decent LinkedIn profile. Unless you don't care. If you're a self-made billionaire, okay, you probably don't need to worry about LinkedIn, but I don't know a lot of those, not in person. The fundamentals, right? Guard your image, and not just guard it, but also, project the way you want to be seen. So a lot of the basics, communications. So those are the things. So the book is really, it's got two parts, right? It's got the front part, which is all the basics, all the things, which by the way are great if you're somewhere between, just out of college and mid-career. And then the second part of the book, which is really about, using your advantages, what makes you different as an advantage. But Damon, the basics. Don't forget the basics. I've interviewed people in their 40s with incredible trajectories, and they come to an interview and they flunk a behavioral question. That question that you get in every interview, which goes something like, tell us a time when, you were in a situation where there's friction or conflict, and how did you resolve it? Right. I mean, come on.
Yeah.
And I've seen them time and again flunk.
No, I'm with you.
The last part of the interview, Damon, where they go, ask, now it's your time to ask questions. And they go, hey, what's the salary and what are the benefits and that kind of thing. It's like, no, do the prep.
Yeah.
Ask smart questions because that's your opportunity to differentiate yourself. A lot of the people flunk the fundamentals.
Yeah, do your prep. I mean, as we wrap up here, I mean, with ChatGPT and AI, I mean, there's
Oh,
no
yeah,
excuse to come in unprepared. Well, Juan, you're an amazing storyteller. I loved your book. We talked about everything about making uniqueness your superpower. Kind of went through your career and about how life isn't typically non-linear.
that's
Um,
right.
how communication is so important, basically the most important skill. And we close out right there, which I think is really important, is don't forget the fundamentals and the basics. With so many great topics, Juan. Where can our listeners connect with you at?
So I'm on LinkedIn, of course. I do have a website which is called juansilvera.com. Very creative. Books available on Amazon, and I'm also on X, or Twitter as they used to call it, and the handle is at Juan Silvera. So through any of those, feel free to connect. Network is always expanding like the universe, and so I'm always happy to make new acquaintances and grow the network. But that's where you find me, on X, on LinkedIn, and then the books on Amazon.
We'll put links to all of those in show notes. And so, listeners, what I'd like you to do is if you know of someone who maybe doesn't realize that they are unique and maybe they do speak a second language and they're kind of struggling in their career path or looking to get a promotion, take this episode and send it to them. And definitely check out Juan's book, Improbably Successful. I read it. I thought it was awesome. And until next time, everybody, remember to stay curious, keep learning, and have a great day. See ya.